Fantasy as a genre is defined as a genre of speculative fiction set in a fictional universe, often inspired by real-world myth and folklore. And because of this, fantasy film has existed from almost the beginning of cinema. In the early 20th century, when film was only just beginning to become prevalent, the writing of original screenplays was still a very young art, meaning many writers drew on fairy tales and fables for material. One of the earliest fantasy filmmakers was ex-stage magician Georges Méliès, one of the fathers of modern filmmaking, who produced fantasy works such as The Haunted Castle, a short film about two men in, surprisingly, a haunted castle. Fantasy has endured as a genre, most likely due to the massive amount of source material to draw on and the nostalgic escapism of a knight in shining armor, or a fairy tale. Just a quick rundown of fantasy over the last 100 years. In the 1900s and 1910s, it was whimsical and experimental, with films such as The Haunted Castle. In the 1920s, it took a darker turn as a result of the German Expressionist movement, the most famous of these being Nosferatu. In the 1930s, this dark trend continued, but with more classic narratives, such as Frankenstein. In the 1940s, most major film industries were producing World War II propaganda, but a colored remake of earlier fantasy classic The Thief of Baghdad was released. In the 1950s, fantasy film took a turn towards ancient myth and legend, starting the sword and sandals craze, with films such as The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. In the 1960s, mythological fantasy was still going strong, with the release of the iconic Jason and the Argonauts. In the 1970s, fantasy began to travel into the sword and sorcery era, with the release of satirical King Arthur film Monty Python and the Holy Grail. In the 1980s, the cult following of Dungeons & Dragons and the more grungy tones of film led to action-packed bloody fantasy films such as Excalibur, still strongly rooted in the medieval period. In the 1990s, with the huge revelations in special effects, many films experimenting with CGI were released, including Dragonheart. And whilst the special effects in these were often quite noticeable, they set the stage for what was to come. In the 2000s, fantasy experienced a resurgence like never before, with the release of massive franchises such as The Lord of the Rings. In the 2010s, fantasy began to decline again, slipping more and more into children's animated features or straight-to-streaming service flicks, with only very noticeable films being those who built off a franchise from the fantasy resurgence, such as the controversial Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, or the Hobbit films. Now, all films on this timeline have one thing in common apart from all being fantasy films. They all had what were considered high quality and perhaps even revolutionary special effects for their time. Except you, Monty Python, sorry. The costume and makeup in Nosferatu, the bright colours of the Thief of Baghdad remake, the resurrecting skeletons of Jason and the Argonauts, and basically everything in The Lord of the Rings. Whilst fantasy as a genre tends to be very difficult to define, one thing often associated with it is high-quality production design, from costumes to set pieces to special effects, in order to better help the audience suspend their disbelief and travel to a land of whimsy and magic. The Pirates of the Caribbean films are an exemplary example of this, with large-scale ship set pieces, battles, and undead magical creatures. Another key feature of fantasy is the hero's journey, a theory proposed by Joseph Campbell in the 1950s that most, if not all, myths and stories follow a formula, and due to almost all notable fantasy drawing from works of literature, this has become a common trait throughout fantasy films. For example, Harry Potter is a distinct example of this, with Harry fulfilling most, if not all, the characteristics of the hero's journey. One underrated trait of what makes a fantasy film is how it sounds. Sound design is one of the most important parts of film as a whole, and is especially important in fantasy. In a world where magic and monsters are prevalent, music and sound effects can help ground a film and let us know what characters are feeling. Take, for example, this segment from the first Lord of the Rings film.
Go back to the shadow. You shall not pass!
In this segment, Gandalf, a beloved main character, seemingly dies, and note how quickly the music changes from dramatic drums to angelic choir, and how all other sound is suppressed. This segment also serves to demonstrate other key characteristics of a fantasy film: large amounts of special effects in the Balrog, set pieces and costumes such as the orc's armor and the cavern, as well as a key component of the hero's journey, the death of a mentor. Fantasy film is a genre that has endured and will continue to endure, although with declining popularity in recent years, and is an important part of film.